Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody. We're going to have our questions now. And I'm looking forward to hearing from as many people in the room as possible with your questions. So, for this section, who would like to start the questions and answers for our panel? And you'll see that Taz and Karen have been joined by Jenny and James, who were co-authors of Taz's presentation as well. So looking forward to the questions now. If you'd like to raise your hand, and Caroline and Connor will be around with the microphone. So we have a question at table 14. On this side, Caroline, thanks.
Hi, I'm Nicola. Can the experts speak on whether there are changes planned regarding biodiversity and sustainability policy within single species plantation in forestry? From where I'm from, in kind of northeastern Galway, there's a lot of bogland, and on that is pine or some sort of single species, completely not biodiverse. They're there for quick crop, don't provide any, you go into them, they're horrible places. And also, we're very interested to hear from forestry in terms of what happens to those areas after the trees have been cut down, because they seem really apocalyptic. You know, they're left just torn up. And, you know, what happens after that, or is there a purpose to that? So whether the speakers here can answer on that, or maybe another day if forestry can join us.
Thanks, Nicola. We will be addressing forestry specifically the next weekend, but would one of our panel like to take that? Yeah, James? Yeah. Thank you.
So just on the forest strategies at the moment, they're being looked at by the Department of Agriculture, the Marine Pippa Hackett's sector at the moment. There's a new forestry strategy being built. A lot of debate around that in terms of the forestry model that we have now are essentially Sitka spruce dominated plantations. There's a certain amount that has changed since the 90s in terms of the incorporation of 15% biodiversity areas and 50% for diverse species mix. So we cannot, in the plantings that have happened in the last forestry cycle, for example, in the last 5 to 7 years, the requirements have already changed. I think we're going to see big changes in the next forestry programme, and there's also quite an amount being looked at by both the Forest Service themselves and Coillte in terms of looking at the possibilities of continuous cover forestry models in terms of moving away from this planting, 30-year rotation, clear fell, back planting again, which is a very sort of boom-bust cycle in terms of the ecology of the overall plantation itself, you know. So that is evolving at the moment. I think we're going to see a very different type of forestry strategy in the next number of years. But along with a lot of other land use, we're dealing with an awful lot of legacy issues, you know, in the past through to lack of understanding and an overriding emphasis on the economic model in terms of the need for wood to replace other carbon intensive in our building sector, for example. So it's quite a complex issue, but I think the forestry model, the area that you're living in probably at the moment, it's the trees that you're seeing now are the result of a forestry policy from 30 to 80 years ago, and even the things that are planted in the last 10 years we would hope would not give a resultant landscape that looks like what you're dealing with at the moment. But essentially we have to try and rehabilitate them areas as well as converging on a new forestry cycle.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Nicola. We have a spreadsheet of questions as well that are coming through from the facilitator notes, and I think Louise at table 1 had a question that's relevant. So yeah, Louise.
Thank you. So our question was just, are there any consequences for the Irish government for not meeting the targets in their yearly climate action plans, like more than the environmental consequences, which are obvious?
Yeah. I think that's for me.
Yeah, I think so too.
I can answer that one. And this is what I was trying to explain, because it all gets a bit complicated. There's EU targets that we are legally obliged to meet as part of, we've signed up to, and then there's national targets, similar but different. So on the EU target, for example, I was saying that we didn't meet our 2020 commitment. The consequence is you have to meet it. So if some people talk about fines, it's not a fine per se. you actually have to buy carbon credits from countries that overachieved. So there's a cost associated with it, and that's non-negotiable. You just meet it. And I suppose from our perspective, what that means is then there's money that ends up being spent buying credits from other countries that could have been invested in Ireland and getting reductions in a much more sustainable way. At a national level, you've got then the 51% reduction, which is now written into the Climate Act. And I suppose the consequences for not meeting, there's a carbon budget from 2021 to 2025 and then 25 to 2030. What we have, as an agency, our role is to report and say, how has Ireland Inc. done to meet it? Worse, what we've seen is there was a 4.7% increase in emissions rather than a reduction. And what we say then is, to hit your 21 to 25 target, you're going to need to, Ireland Inc. is going to need to reduce by 8.4% reduction every year. So you're making it much more difficult to do. And the issue, each minister then is accountable to the Oireachtas for their carbon budget and their sector. How it will play out, I just wouldn't want to predict in 2025. If you don't meet it, it's not like the EU and you have to kind of buy credits. But what the consequences are for the government, potentially somebody could take them to court and say you haven't met your own act. But that still is to be played out.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that, and thanks for that question, Louise. So, sorry, there's a hand up here on table 6. Caroline is coming to you. And just to say as well, that the questions that we have logged here and that we don't get to from the audience now, we will answer them tomorrow in the plenary session in the morning. So just to let you know, all questions will be answered. Sorry for interrupting.
Robert's mine, and this is sort of directly related to what we just asked her a minute ago. Regarding the targets, we want to know what's driving to accept targets that we obviously can't meet. We've seen the history shows we're not meeting any of these targets. Is it politics? Is it business? Why are we accepting targets that we obviously can't meet?
Okay, thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Laura, are you okay?
I'd reframe that in that we know climate change is happening. We know from whether it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the experts that we need to reduce our emissions. So the question will be is, why aren't we taking the actions to meet the targets? At an EU level, that's why I kind of was talking about the EU bubble. It's actually looked at and saying, well, which countries, like how can each country meet your target? So some countries will take a bigger hit than others to average out, whether it's a 40% reduction or whatever it might be. So it's not that just willy-nilly at an EU level a target is set out. It is thought through. What we would see in the context of the 2030 target from an EU level, so it's kind of back to EU bubble versus national, that if all the plans and policies were implemented and delivered as anticipated, we would meet it. So therefore, it's a question of implementation. With regard to the national target, that came from a recommendation that there should be a 7% reduction per annum kind of globally. But I would focus on the EU one because that's the one, it's not accepting the target we can't hit. It's about implementing the actions and then we will meet it.
I'll bring. Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much for that. To be discussed. Kieran, on table 9.
In the area I live in, there's quite a few farms which are wonderfully untidy. Is that working? Yeah. Sorry. And as soon as someone dies, or as soon as they're sold, they're obliterated. They're bulldozed away, and you get Italian ryegrass. I think we should have some system of identifying and supporting those farms.
Thank you very much, Kieran. James, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I do a lot of work actually on them high nature value farmland systems. So these are identified, but the big issue we have at the moment in our prevailing economic and food system at the moment is that the nature, the carbon storage on them farms, the water quality on them farms isn't recognised in the economic system. So the farmers that take over them that need to make a viable income from that don't get paid for the other additional services. So what's been looked at is the creation of new forms of agri-environmental schemes to pay for these additional services, to give people the opportunity that there will be alternatives, rather than converting some of these areas that are existing in terms of high nature value, high carbon storage, very important for water quality, that they can potentially make an income from that, as well as from the food and fibre provision side of things as well. But the problem that you see at the moment is the main economic signals or business signals that the farmers taking over them farms are getting is that to make them economically viable is they convert it to maximise the food production from them areas.
Thanks, James. We have a question from table 4.
Hi, my name is David. We've seen a lot of examples of biodiversity habitats set in rural areas. I'm just wondering, is there any expert here, or will we be dealing with any expert who can give us guidance on urban biodiversity planning?
Thanks, David. I will throw that over to Taz.
Again, maybe something for one of the future sessions. I think this, the next but one, we're looking at those kind of different places for biodiversity, and then we will hopefully be able to source someone to answer that question. I think it's a very important and valuable point, actually, because not least because I think a significant, high proportion of the population experiences biodiversity in an urban setting. So it means a lot if we can enrich and enhance the biodiversity in the urban setting, just from the point of view of people's capacity to engage with it and see it day by day. So I think it's a really important point. And we will look to it, yeah.
And just to follow on that, David, we will be looking at urban landscapes specifically in the weekend after this weekend. But I just see here on the Google Sheet that Ian on table 3 had a question that matches that. And actually, it might be good to address it now, Ian, if you don't mind. Caroline's going to come over with the microphone.
Hi. So it was just a question in relation to, obviously, habitat loss as being one of the big areas. And where obviously we're a growing population and we need to kind of take over some habitats in order for housing, and we're obviously in a housing crisis at the same time, but how do we manage habitat loss as well as trying to build for a growing population?
Laura, thank you.
We could probably do maybe a bit of both. We need to be careful about spreading, one of the challenges we have, and I'll kind of come back to the climate change, is things like transport. We're a very dispersed population. So I know in the context of national development plans, housing plans, etc., is to look at the areas and can you concentrate where they're already in towns and villages or in cities and use kind of brownfield sites, etc., rather than this constant, spreading further and further out. So there is plans, and there have previously been plans to kind of focus those kind of increased development in cities and towns already there, so that you would then have your habitat protected. But it is always a balance. That is a balanced debate, but it's about proper planning, I would say, rather than just kind of the ad hoc approach, and looking at what does improper planning mean for climate change, because then you have people having to get into a car and to drive to places, as well as things like habitat loss as well. So it's really trying to take everything in the round. And one of, in decision making now much more is strategic environmental assessment. So looking overall at plans and policies, so whether that be a national development plan, etc., what is the environmental impact, and then local environmental impact assessments as well to help decision making.
And just to kind of complement that, and actually also in relation to the previous question, there is also scope to improve the value of the built environment for nature as well, and I think it's important to be kind of picking up those initiatives too. So, I mean, things like green roofs and green walls and so on are part of that process, and in fact, I've been working with a team on a project to try to enhance the surfaces of seawalls in, for example, Dublin Port or anywhere else, where you just put more complexity on the surface and it creates an environment that's more suitable for biodiversity. So there's a lot of possibilities to try to mitigate that kind of expansion as well.
Thanks. Jenny, would you like to respond to any of the questions before we wrap for coffee?
Yeah, I would just add to Taz there and echoing Laura that if you do incorporate biodiversity, good biodiversity planning in urban environments, there are co-benefits for human health. And a good example would be street trees and trees, expanding the number of trees in parks because these absorb atmospheric pollution. So you're increasing biodiversity and you're also increasing human well-being in those urban environments.
Thanks for that, Jenny. Thanks everyone for all those questions as well. As I said, anything that isn't answered, we'll put it into the plenary session for tomorrow. But I think you'll all enjoy 20 minutes now, stretch your legs, maybe get some fresh air, have a little chat and a breather before we jump back in again. So see you in 20 minutes.